Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Eric G, and you're watching Cooking with Eric G. Alright, so for the first episode, we're going to be making some cheesy Parmesan skillet potatoes and some grilled ribeyes. Now, I got the ribeyes from the store and the potatoes earlier today. I'm going to leave the skin on. These are just two russet potatoes, and I have two boneless ribeyes that are pretty well marbled. The first thing we're going to do is get these ribeyes out and get them seasoned. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and get these ribeyes opened up. Like I said, I picked them up from the store earlier today. Now, this is going to be very subjective in terms of how these ribeyes are seasoned. You can season them however you want, but I'm going to go through the list of things that I'm using for them. One thing you are going to need, at least for my recipe, is a bottle of Dale's seasoning. You can use low sodium kind if you want. I typically use the red label, which does have considerably more sodium in it, but I think it gives it a much better flavor overall for the steaks. So go ahead and get those dumped in. So typically what I will do when I'm seasoning my steaks is before I put the Dale's seasoning on, I will go ahead and use whatever seasonings I'm going to use for this. So for this, we're going to use some onion powder. We're going to use some of the Spice Islands smoked paprika. If you can't find the Spice Islands, any smoked paprika should do. We're also going to use a little bit of Mrs. Dash table blend, not the regular Mrs. Dash. And we're also going to use some of the California garlic powder. And because I like to have a little bit of kick to mine, we're also going to use some cayenne pepper or some ground cayenne red pepper. So with that, I typically go ahead and use the smoked paprika first. The smoked paprika has a really good flavor. It also has a very nice scent as well for the steaks. Typically, I would let these steaks marinate for at least 2 hours. I'm not going to do that today, but I'll probably get it to marinate for about 30 minutes or so, and that should be enough for this. And then with the cayenne pepper, you can use as much or as little as you like. The same with the seasonings. I typically do not use a lot of the garlic powder just because garlic does have a pretty strong flavor to it, and it can be a little overpowering. But if you like garlic, use as much as you want. So go ahead and get that on there. Also, I don't measure any of my spices when I make anything. And the reason for that is I just kind of eyeball it, and I just kind of go by what looks well or what looks good to me. And I'll just go until everything is pretty much covered, at least decently well. One other thing that I will probably use that I did forget to mention is a little bit of meat tenderizer. You typically don't need to use it depending on the cut of steak that you have, but I usually use the Adolph's meat tenderizer, which is pretty good stuff. Yep. I thought I had one that was open, but apparently not. So go ahead and get this open. And you typically want to use some meat tenderizer if you're not really going to marinate the steak too long. I use it just because I want this to be as tender as I can get it. And it's generally pretty tender when I'm done grilling these. One of the other things is, depending on how you want it cooked, that's going to be up to you. I typically cook my steaks medium well, give or take. And some of you will hate me for this, but sometimes I will cook it well done. But for this one, I'll probably try to cook it about medium well. So now that I have the steak seasoned, I'm gonna go ahead and use the Del seasoning or the Del sauce on here. And again, if you don't want too much sodium, and this does have a lot of sodium. This is 1,220 milligrams per serving, and that's per tablespoon. So it's a lot of sodium. But if you don't want that, you can use the green label to use a little bit less sodium in this as well. So the next thing I'll do is I'll just make sure that I get this decently covered. Generally don't want to use too much, but this might actually be too much. And one other thing you can do that I typically do is I'll take a fork and basically I'll just kind of stab the steak a little bit, just so I can get some of that Del seasoning in here just a little bit more than it normally would get absorbed into the meat in this short amount of time. And if you do cover the steaks like this, be careful because it will kind of splash out like it just did here. So I'll go ahead and get that. And this will also help the meat get tenderized just a little bit more. All right. So now we got the steaks seasoned, it's time to go ahead and start cutting up the potatoes. All right, so I went ahead and put the steaks in the refrigerator so that they can marinate for a little bit. So we're gonna go ahead and start cutting up the potatoes. Now you have free liberty to cut these up however you want. Some people like to do the sliced potatoes, kind of like scallop potatoes. What I'm gonna do is more of a diced tomato, or potato, sorry, not tomato, potato. So I've already washed these. Make sure you wash to get the dirt off from the store. These little divots or roots that grow out of the potatoes, I'm typically just going to cut those off. There's going to be several pits or anything like that. And if you're using a really sharp knife, please be careful with this. But you don't need me to tell you that. These knives I got from Costco, they are sharp. These are made by Tramontina. They are very nice knives. They are extremely sharp. So be careful with these. So let me go ahead and start cutting these. And I can't stress the importance of having a sharp knife either. I've cooked and chopped up vegetables with semi-sharp knives, and having a really sharp knife makes the job so much easier. As you can see, this knife is cutting through these potatoes like butter. And I typically don't get that with a standard knife. Sometimes I'll use a steak knife, that's all I have, but since I just bought these, I want to make sure that I put them to good use. So go ahead and get these chopped up, and I'll be right back as soon as I get these potatoes cut up. All right, now that the potatoes are cut up, one of the things that I forgot to mention before is that when you cut the potatoes up, and you don't want them to turn brown, just go ahead and put them in some clean water until you're ready to use them, and that will keep the potatoes from turning brown. So the next step is to start our roux, and we're going to use a white roux or a blonde roux, and this is just so that we can get a little bit of texture in the sauce that we're going to cook the potatoes in. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. All right, now to get started with the roux, I'm just going to use 2 tablespoons of butter, and I'm using no salt added butter for this. I already had it in the refrigerator, so I'm going to go ahead and use the rest of this now. And I'm just going to melt the butter. And one of the reasons I use butter instead of oil, which a lot of people typically use for a roux, is because the butter gives the roux a much richer flavor. And it also doesn't give it a really oily consistency either. And one of the things I typically don't like about standard roux are that the roux typically has a really oily feeling to it, and it kind of ruins the meal or the dish for me. So we're going to go ahead and get this melted. And once this butter is melted, we'll start adding the flour. Now, I'm probably only going to use maybe 2 to 3 teaspoons of flour for this roux because I don't want a very thick roux. And once we get the flour added in, we're also going to add a little bit of milk. Now, depending on how much milk you need will depend on how thick you want your roux to be. Because I want the cheese sauce to be fairly light and thin, I'm going to use quite a bit of milk. And for this, I have 1 pint of whole milk that I'm going to use for this. So we almost got the butter melted here. So at this point, I'll start to add the flour. And you want to make sure that you don't burn the roux. If you burn it, or you start to smell it burning, or it turns brown, start over. You do not want that to affect the flavor or the texture of your potatoes. So typically I'm only going to let this brown just a little bit until it's just a slightly dark yellow consistency. And this is good enough for me. This is very light. It hasn't really started to brown yet, but it's thick enough where I can start adding some of the milk. And for the milk, I'm just going to pour this in. And once you get your roux to the consistency and the color that you like, you can go ahead and turn it down. And you're going to see that the roux is going to start to thicken up. And once it starts to thicken up, that's when you can go ahead and start adding more milk. Because you do want this to be a fairly thin roux. Another thing to take into consideration is that the roux is going to thicken up when we start adding the cheese to it as well. So you don't want to get it too thick, or you don't want to keep it too thick. So basically, you just want to go ahead and get that stirred in, and you'll see that the roux is starting to thin out. It is still fairly thick, but that's okay because we're going to add the cheese to it, and we're going to add more milk to it, and that is going to thin out the roux as well as start to give it a really nice flavor. So now that my roux is right about the consistency that I want, and I probably should have only used 2 teaspoons of flour instead of 3, but that's okay. I'm using 2 pretty large potatoes. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm using finely shredded Parmesan for this. So you just wanna go ahead and start adding your Parmesan. And I'm using a pretty good handful of the cheese right now. And I'm just gonna sprinkle that into the roux. And I'm gonna put one more good handful in there. And depending on how big your hands are, you may wanna use an extra one. I do have fairly large hands. So now that we have that in there, just want to go ahead and start stirring the cheese in until it starts to melt. And you'll feel the roux start to thicken up a little bit more. But once it does start to thicken up, you'll see that the cheese is melting. And that's one of the reasons I use the finely shredded Parmesan, because the cheese will melt a little bit quicker than it normally would. But now that this is going, or this is getting melted really well, I'm just going to add a little bit more milk to it, just to thin this out. The other thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that you have a colander handy so that you can, or a strainer so that you can drain the potatoes out of the water. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I have a pretty large strainer, so I'm going to go ahead and drain these potatoes. So the cheese sauce is just about done. Now, in terms of seasoning for the cheese sauce, I'm also going to put in some dehydrated parsley, just to give it a little bit of color, and kind of spice it up a little bit. And I like to use parsley in a lot of the stuff that I make too, so that's another reason. So now that I got the parsley in, I'm also going to use a little bit of the smoked paprika in the cheese sauce as well. And this is going to make the cheese sauce turn kind of a reddish color, so don't worry about that. And we're also going to use some of the smoked sea salt in here as well. And the smoked sea salt, honestly, I've never used it. I saw it at the store and I wanted to try it. So I'm just going to get that in there. And this is going to give it a pretty smoky flavor with the smoked paprika as well. So now that this is going, you don't want the cheese sauce to burn, but you want to go ahead and just get your potatoes in there now and get that stirred up. And with this, you'll see that the cheese sauce is actually getting really, really thick now, which is what I want. And we're going to cook these in the skillet and just let the potatoes cook a while. If you feel that you don't have enough cheese sauce, you can always add more cheese to it and some more milk, and that will thin out everything. Right now I can see that I am going to need to add more cheese and some more milk while this is cooking. So I'll go ahead and get a little bit more milk add in here. So now that I have a little bit more milk, I'm going to add a little bit more cheese to this as well. And you just want to make sure that you have all of the potatoes covered in the cheese sauce, and that you have everything on low heat for right now. We're going to turn the heat up here in just a bit and let this simmer for probably about 20 or 30 minutes, depending on how long it takes for the potatoes to cook. Depending on how thick or thin you chop up your potatoes, it may take longer or it may take less time. And also the amount of heat that you have on the potatoes as well. So while these are cooking, we are going to go ahead and get the grill ready for those ribeyes. All right, so now I got the steaks out of the fridge, and right now the grill is right at 650 degrees, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the grill all the way down because I don't want to burn the steaks. So I'm just going to go ahead and cook these in the middle. Get those tossed on there. And depending on your grill, you may have to spread them out a little bit. Turn this one off, put them right here on that side. And also don't want to waste all of this good dill sauce and the rest of the seasoning that I have, so I'm going to save this and just kind of drizzle it on the steak while it's cooking as well, and make sure that it doesn't dry out, which it shouldn't dry out because I'm not going to overcook it, but I just want to go ahead and get that on there just to get a little bit of extra flavor in the steak. So go ahead and let that cook for a little bit, and I will be right back. All right, so come out here and check on these steaks just a little bit, see how they're doing. And these seem to be going very well. Oh yeah, that's looking really good right there. And like I said, you cook these however you want. I typically like my steaks to be a little bit more done than most people. And I'll take a little bit of seasoning. Get that on there. And one of the reasons that I do this is because this will make the steak very, very flavorful as well. Anybody that knows me knows that I like a lot of flavor in my food. I don't like stuff to be bland or just kind of tastes like you need to cover it in salt or anything. Probably gonna let those steaks cook for a few more minutes and flip them again. I like to get the char grills or the char marks on the steaks as well. So we'll be right back. And actually, let's go check on those potatoes. All right, so I just turned the heat off on these potatoes. They look like they're done now. We have a nice little bit of crust from the cheese on here as well. You can see some of it right there. There's this nice variation on the consistency with the cheese. Those steaks are just about done. So I'm going to go ahead and check on those, and I will be right back. All right, so I just got the steaks off the grill, and it looked like they came out very well. I didn't quite get the char marks on this one the way that I would typically like it, but this one, go ahead and get that on there. And you can also see one of the reasons I use the dill or so much dill seasoning on here is because it does not dry the steak out at all. It has a very good texture to it, has excellent flavor. And to go ahead and go with this, we have the skillet Parmesan potatoes, and let's get a good scoop of that on there. And now we have our finished product. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this episode of Cooking with Eric G. Like I said, this is my first episode. So hopefully I'll be back and be able to make some more of these for you guys. But if you have any questions, drop them in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. And if there's anything that you want to see specifically or would like to see me make, just put them in the comments and I'll see what I can do. Thanks, and enjoy your evening. For real. This is actually pretty good.